Charles Darwin was an unlikely candidate for scientific stardom. As a young man, he was not considered very promising. In fact, his father once said to him, "You care for nothing but dog shooting and rat catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and to your family." He entered college planning to be a clergyman, but when he got a chance to go on a round-the-world cruise as a young, unpaid naturalist, he snapped up the opportunity. And Darwin's 5-year voyage on HMS Beagle led to a revolution in the way we look at the natural world and to a new beginning for all of biology. Here's the way he cautiously but accurately summarized that voyage in the very first paragraph of one of the most famous books of science of all time, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. When on board HMS Beagle as naturalist, I was much struck with certain facts in the distribution of organic beings inhabiting South America and in the geological relations of the present to the past inhabitants of that continent. These facts, as will be seen in the later chapters of this volume, seem to throw some light on the origin of species, that mystery of mysteries. These facts led Darwin to propose his theory of evolution by natural selection, the most important single unifying theory in all of biology. Darwin, of course, did not start from scratch. Before examining the outlines of his theory of evolution by natural selection, let's see what led up to it. People from prehistoric times could not help noticing the great variety of plants and animals around them. Here, for instance, in southern France, near Lascaux, some of the earliest humans we know of, about 15,000 years ago, painted these elegant pictures of animals important to their lives, deep within their caves. For the most part, people were too busy trying to survive in competition with these other living creatures to give much thought to why there were so many, or to wonder how they got to be the way they were, in some ways like humans and in other ways very different. To those who did have the time or inclination to speculate about such questions, the most common answer was that a god or gods made them that way. Many also believed that the same god or gods made other living creatures to please and serve one particular kind of living creature, human beings. In the ancient Greek Ionian cities, now in ruins on the western coast of modern Turkey, some of the world's first philosopher-scientists dared to ask and answer questions like this in a different way. Anaximander in 550 BC proposed a theory of evolution to explain the likenesses and the differences in living things. All life, said Anaximander, came from the water. Over long periods of time, the water creatures creep out onto the land, develop legs, then fur, and finally human form. Anaximander did not have much evidence to support this theory, nor did he have any idea just how this kind of near miracle could actually have taken place. You see, one of the handicaps early thinkers had was massive ignorance. They knew of only a tiny fraction of the variety of plants and animals on this earth. Aristotle, for instance, one of the first to invent a scientific classification, found room for about 500 species of animals. And as late as 1600, only 6,000 species of plants were known. By way of comparison, today over 2 million species of living things have been described. It was not until the 18th century, about the time that American colonies were beginning to change into the United States, humankind's store of knowledge about this complex living world began to rapidly increase. Explorations into all the far corners of the world became more and more common. Many of the explorers were returning with specimens of new species of plants and animals never before known to Western naturalists. A little earlier, a Dutch lensmaker, Anton van Leeuwenhoek, found a way to view another world no one had ever glimpsed before, a microscopic wonder world teeming with what he called his little beasties. The number and variety of known living creatures was growing by leaps and bounds. How to make sense of all this new knowledge? One of the important early pioneers in biology to make a major start in this direction was a young man in Sweden, Carl Linnaeus. As a university student, he went on a field trip to Lapland to collect plant and animal specimens. A few years after this trip, in 1735, Linnaeus brought out his first book, Systema Naturae. He was a great scholarly hit, and he became an instant celebrity. In this book, he proposed a classification system for living things, and one that is still being used today. All living things, proposed Linnaeus, should be grouped according to a natural and logical system. Each kind of living thing should be given a unique double name in internationally accepted Latin. First would be the genus, followed by the species. It was called a binomial nomenclature system. Similar genera would be grouped together into families, families into orders, orders into classes. Classes would be grouped into a few major phyla, and finally, phyla into kingdoms. Linnaeus brought order and system to the science of the living world, and he helped people to see the reality of living species. He was, however, opposed to the idea that living species were descended from common ancestors, one of the key ideas in modern theories of evolution. Others of the 18th century, however, did begin to speculate on this possibility. One of the most important was a Frenchman, Georges Buffon. A charming, elegant man of great wealth, Buffon was able to devote himself to scientific study without worry of earning a living. He founded one of the first genuine biological research centers in the world, the Jardin du Roi, Garden of the King, in Paris. And in between many love affairs and a few duels, Buffon managed to write 44 volumes of natural history, and these volumes summarized all that was then known about the natural world. In some of these volumes, he anticipated many of the ideas of Darwin and later evolutionists, but he never quite put together a convincing theory to explain how living things became so different and varied, nor why at the same time all living things had so much in common. Buffon's books led the religious authorities, however, to bring him before the Syndic of the Sorbonne in 1751, and they commanded that he withdraw portions of his books that seemed to contradict Holy Scriptures. One of the parts the religious authorities most objected to was Buffon's estimate of the age of the earth at about 100,000 years. Biblical doctrine held that the earth was created in 4004 B.C. Another Frenchman, Jean-Baptiste Lamarque, built upon the foundations laid by Buffon to construct one of the first fully formed, genuinely scientific theories of evolution. As poor as Buffon was rich, Lamarck took over the Jardin du Roi when it became the Jardin des Plantes after the French Revolution, which revolution also executed Buffon and his aristocratic family. Lamarck proposed a theory of evolution which he said reflected the natural order of animals in nature. Now, its key ideas were two. Nature has an innate tendency to evolve in the direction of increasing complexity. And two, acquired characteristics will be passed on to offspring. In this way, nature will slowly move toward increasing variety and complexity and will fill up all the niches of the living world. Lamarck also has the distinction of being the first to coin and to use the word biology. Paradoxically, one of Lamarck's most critical scientific opponents, the anti-evolutionist George Cuvier, laid even more important groundwork for the later flowering of the Darwinian evolutionary theory. This groundwork built on a new look at the unusual forms of rock and bone called fossils. Before Cuvier, fossils were known but little understood. The most common view was that fossils were freaks of nature placed there to amuse and mystify humans. Cuvier spent many years at the Museum of Natural History in Paris, systematically studying fossils found in the limestone deposits around Paris, as well as those brought to the museum from all over the world. He compared the forms left in the rocks with the anatomical structures of living creatures today. He became a world expert at reconstructing an entire animal from a few fossil bones. And he concluded from his study that fossils were the remains of creatures of the past, remains left over from great catastrophes of the past, the greatest catastrophe of which was the great flood described in the Bible when Noah built his ark. Cuvier still believed in an earth of recent creation. An opposite geological view was taken by the Scotsman generally given credit for being the father of modern geology, James Hutton. Hutton viewed the earth as much, much older than Cuvier or Buffon or any of his predecessors. In fact, he saw the earth as having, quote, no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end, unquote. Hutton saw Earth as changing very slowly over very long periods of time, and he saw this change coming from the same geological processes you could see happening today: mountain building, erosion, volcanoes, earthquakes. Hutton's ideas were advanced and popularized by Charles Lyell, whose book Principles of Geology became the first classic work in geology and an important influence on his friend and contemporary Charles Darwin. See, by the middle of the 19th century, ideas about the possible evolution of living things were widespread, but no one had yet convincingly demonstrated just how it could have happened. Now, the man generally given credit for doing this worked here in this study in Down, England, and his name was Charles Darwin. Darwin as a child loved the out-of-doors. He loved hiking and hunting. He was an avid collector of insects, shells, rocks, and other specimens from nature. He had an especially large collection of beetles. It was only after his 5-year-long voyage on HMS Beagle, however, that his intellect caught fire, and he began to think seriously about what he had for so long loved to see, to touch, and to collect. As he wrote of his first views of South American animals and plants, it was like giving a blind man eyes. He filled notebooks with detailed observations of these exciting new plants and animals. He made notes of where they were living, the geology, the climate, the surrounding plants and animals. He made collections of plant parts and animal skins and skeletons, of rocks and minerals, and he carefully labeled and preserved everything for later study. When Darwin did return to England in 1836, he married, had a large family, and settled to a life of quiet study here in the small town of Down, just south of London. Here in this study at Down, he worked each morning, reviewing his notes, examining his specimens, reading what other scientists had observed in their travels and studies, and what they thought. There were so many questions to answer. Questions like, why are the birds he found on one island in the Galapagos Islands very similar but not the same as those he found on a nearby island? Why are the plants he found in one part of South America similar but different in interesting ways from the plants found in the South Pacific Islands? What relation is there between the plants and animals he found on his trip and the fossil remains of plants and animals he also found on his trip? And most important of all were the really big questions. Why are there so many different species of plants and animals anyway? And why, despite this incredible variety, are all living things so much alike? Alike in their basic structures, alike in their basic chemistry, alike in their ways of surviving and of reproducing. As he thought about these questions, out of the thousands and hundreds of thousands of details he had personally observed or read about, there slowly emerged a large, simple pattern. On his daily noontime walks behind the house, overlooking the quiet English countryside, Darwin gradually pieced together his theory of evolution by natural selection, a theory of evolution that is still today one of the bedrocks of modern biology. As so often happens in science, At almost the same time Darwin came to this theory of natural selection, another man was coming to much the same theory. That man was Alfred Russel Wallace. When summarized, like most good scientific theories, the ideas of Darwin and Wallace are surprisingly simple. There are 5 major points. 1. Living creatures have more offspring than can possibly survive. 2. There is variation in these offspring. 3. Some variations give an advantage and some a disadvantage in an inevitable struggle for survival. 4. Nature will select the most fit variations to survive in this struggle, and these variations will be the ones to pass on to the favored offspring. 5. In this way, living things will change over time. Given enough time, these changes will be so great that whole new species of living things will appear on Earth. Darwin's book on the origin of species by means of natural selection and his following book, The Descent of Man, sold out before they were even printed. They made an immediate, a dramatic, and a long-lasting impression on the world of science and of society. In these books, he piled one piece of evidence on another to illustrate and to support his theory of natural selection, and this evidence was so overwhelming it convinced most scientists around the world, then and now. Not everyone was convinced, of course, in his day or in ours. In fact, in his day, Darwin was ridiculed unmercifully in the popular press and in the pulpit, even by some scientists. Today, although there is disagreement and uncertainty about some of the details of Earth history and of Darwinian theory, there is also a very broad agreement on the overall theory. And like all good scientific theories, the theory of evolution by natural selection points the way to fruitful new areas of research on the living world of the past, the present, and the future. As to the past, one exciting area of research closely related to Darwin's theory of evolution is the history of dinosaurs. For instance,
100 million years ago, you might have seen a dinosaur coming around that bend. About 10 years ago, if you were standing in this very spot in Gubbio, Italy, you would have seen an American physicist and his geologist son digging in these rocks right here and later figuring out why you don't see dinosaurs anymore.
What they found right here in this rock face was a thin layer that could be accurately dated at about 65 million years ago.
It's right there. There's the clay layer, only about a centimeter thick, that separates geological epochs. And in that clay layer, you find iridium.
This iridium helped them to come up with a plausible theory as to why the dinosaurs became extinct in such a short period of time after having roamed the Earth for over 50 million years. The iridium, they theorized, came from the global fallout when a giant meteor struck the Earth 65 million years ago. Other lines of evidence pointed to a spot off the coast of what is now southern Mexico, where the giant meteor hit the Earth, sending out huge clouds of dust that blanketed the Earth's atmosphere, cutting off the sunlight for a few years. After over 100 million years of change in the world of dinosaurs, this drastic alteration in the environment was too much for any variation to cope with, and it led to the extinction of all dinosaurs. As to the present and future, for example, we can see evolution going on today remarkably fast as disease-causing bacteria change to become immune to our latest antibiotic. We can see the changes in insects as their hereditary structures are modified to escape the harmful effects of our latest insecticide. And by using the theory of natural selection, first clearly stated by Darwin, biologists and ecologists today can better know where to look and how to cope with these and other changes in the living environment today and tomorrow. Although evolution by natural selection is accepted today by most professional scientists, as one of the key scientific theories that help us make sense of the natural world. It is also still controversial. On the one hand, it is rejected, as it was in Darwin's time, by some religious groups as taking away from the biblical story of creation. On the other hand, it has been extended and used in modern times to both support and to denounce social movements like capitalism, socialism, communism, fascism, manifest destiny, progressive education, racism, sexism, and more. Looking into these claims would take us far beyond this program. Looking back now with 20/20 hindsight, however, we can at the very least see how wrong Darwin's father was. The young man who was good for nothing but shooting and rat catching did indeed leave the world of science and the world of society a very different place. When he wrote, "When on board His Majesty's ship Beagle as naturalist, I was much struck with certain facts in the distribution of the organic beings inhabiting South America, and the geological relation of the present to the past inhabitants of that continent. These facts seem to throw some light on the origin of species, that mystery of mysteries."